Just a forewarning, in this episode of Icons, I'll be briefly mentioning topics that may be distressing for listeners to hear, including abuse, Nazism, and suicide. But with that said, let's begin. One day, without thinking of exactly what she was up to, Chanel wandered into Balzan's bedroom and pilfered through some of his clothes. She started to wear outfits that were totally her own invention. His open-collared shirts and tweed coats, paired with some of her own clothes, all topped with a man's straw boater hat. In wearing these clothes, she noticed two things. She felt an incredible sense of freedom as she left behind the corsets, constricting gowns, and fussy headpieces women were wearing, and she reveled in the new kind of attention she received. The other courtesans now watched her with unconcealed envy. These new outfits suited her figure well, and nobody had ever seen a woman dressed quite in this manner. And this quote is taken from Robert Greene's book, The Laws of Human Nature, which heavily features today's artist as a character to study. But this is only one of the books I read in preparation for this episode of Icons, as I'll actually be quoting most from an incredible biography I read called Coco Chanel, The Legend and the Life by Justine Bacardi. And for those of you who are new here, Icons is a podcast where I dive deep into the creative process and philosophy behind the works of great artistic masters. And Gabrielle Coco Chanel is absolutely a master artist. She's a fashion designer who had an unparalleled impact despite stepping into a fashion world that was, at the time, run and owned only by men. And on top of that, I learned that she started her artistic career having been abandoned in an orphanage as a child, so she was definitely starting at less than zero. And yet, she became one of the most successful fashion designers ever, and her brand is still commonplace among the top fashion houses across the world. I was actually lucky enough to visit an exhibition at the V&A, also in preparation for this episode, called Gabrielle Chanel Fashion Manifesto. And I have to note, it had the most incredible production. I had not seen an exhibition quite like it for a long time. And two rooms in particular stand out. One jumps out at you because it has this curved row of dresses that spans across the entire room. Each dress kind of individually encased in glass, arranged in a way that when you step back, the dresses actually combine to make this beautiful gradient of color and style. And another room beautifully recreates the famous shredded mirror and staircase that connects the shop floor and Chanel's apartment in the Chanel store in Rue Cambon, Paris. But I'm actually noting this exhibition mostly because it was actually claustrophobic due to the huge number of women who attended the exhibition in droves to see the work of Gabrielle Coco Chanel, which really highlights her lasting impact. Throughout her career, Chanel designed and sold hats, jackets, dresses, and perfume, each drastically unique from what had already existed for women. And her philosophy in her approach towards each of these avenues can kind of be explored through a quote that I took from a documentary I also watched, which notes that the demands she placed on clothes and the solutions that she came up with were things that were suggested to her by her life as a modern woman. These weren't clothes to be ostentatious displays of wealth. These were clothes for getting on with business. But if you are listening to this thinking your own work has no relation to fashion, believe me, we'll be deriving a lot of insights from Chanel that any artist of any kind can add to their approach to work. I want to now return to Robert Greene's book for a moment to further examine Chanel's first encounter with making her own clothes. The book reads, Balzan himself was charmed. He introduced her to his tailor, and on her instructions, the tailor custom made for her a boy's riding costume. She taught herself to ride horses, but not side saddle like other women. She always had an athletic bent to her character, and within months, she'd become an expert rider. Now she could be seen everywhere in her strange riding costume. As she progressed with this new persona, it finally became clear to her the nature of her vague longings. What she wanted was the power and freedom that men possessed, which was reflected in the less constricting clothes that they wore, and she could sense that other courtesans and women at the chateau could identify with this. It was something in the air, a repressed desire she had tapped into. Within a few weeks, several courtesans began to visit her in her room and try on the straw hats that she had decorated with ribbons and feathers. Compared with the elaborate hats that women had to pin on their heads, these were simple and easy to wear. The courtesans now strode around town with Chanel's hats on their heads, and soon other women in the area were asking where they could buy them. Balzan offered her the use of his apartment in Paris where she could begin to make more of her hats and perhaps go into business. She happily took up the offer. And with that, let's begin this episode of Icons, where we'll explore the creative lessons bred from studying the artist who changed the world of fashion completely, where we'll cover the fear of abandonment Chanel had, the impact the orphanage had on her work, Chanel's lies, altering of narrative and manipulation of image, Chanel's creative edge, her constant demand of independence, lessons we can learn about marketing from Chanel, as well as her creative approach, which can be likened to that of the image of scissors. And as always, all the art I mentioned throughout the episode is listed in the description, so no need to frantically Google everything as you listen to this. Gabrielle's father was not present at her birth, setting a pattern that was to be repeated thereafter. A man who often appeared to be on the run from his family, he had already vanished when Jeanne, Chanel's mother, became pregnant with their first child and refused to marry her when he was finally tracked down a month before she gave birth to their daughter Julia. Consequently, both of the girls were born illegitimate. It was not until Gabrielle was 15 months old that her parents eventually married. And whilst Chanel accredits learning how to sew to her father, as she assisted in his business, going town to town, selling clothes to peasants, once Chanel's mother died when Chanel was only 12 years old, her relationship with her father becomes non-existent. Chanel hated the sight of doors. She said they would remind her of those who had already left, and those who would leave her again. Chanel was abandoned at Aubazine, a medieval village dominated by a 12th century monastery and abbey, which became the home of the orphanage that Chanel then lived in. Her father left her to two nuns who ran the orphanage in the abbey walls with her two sisters, Julia and Antoinette, soon after the death of their mother. He also left his two sons to a peasant family, and the father, being the terrible father that he seems to be, disappeared off to America, where he was never again seen by Chanel. And I think this is quite important for us to be aware of, as this fear of abandonment plagues Chanel during her early years. It was actually in this orphanage that Chanel refers to the nuns that she was ultimately raised by as her aunts, noting that my aunts were good people, but absolutely without tenderness. I was not loved in their house. I got no affection. Children suffer from such things. It was here that Chanel began her first suicidal thoughts, of which she had many throughout her life. She notes here, I wanted to kill myself I don't know how many times. I couldn't stand hearing my mother talked about in that way anymore. Like all children, I listened at closed doors. I learned that my father had ruined my mother. All the same, she married the man she loved, and having to hear people call me an orphan, they felt sorry for me. I had nothing to be pitied for. I had a father, and you wonder here how much she felt that there was no love in her childhood, mostly because she also refused to accept it from others, as you can kind of get a sense of in this passage. But despite his abandonment of Chanel, in her mind, she identifies more actually with her father than anyone else in her family. And I think this duality of both feeling betrayed and abandoned by your father, but also feeling that you are like your father, is one that she has to contend with a lot throughout her life. But in doing so, she develops this kind of retrospective narrative on his behalf that I think somewhat favors him, as she'll do that sort of thing often with her own memories. In the book, it says, Gabrielle told many stories, and she used them to protect his memory, identifying with him rather than her sickly mother. It was as if she felt her father had been right to leave his wife and children, and sought to portray his flight as an act of youthful strength. In this version of her past, Gabrielle reinvented him as a far younger man, not yet 30, and the father of only 2 daughters, rather than a man approaching 40 who had cast off 5 children along with a dead wife. He'd made a new life, she said. I understand that. His 2 daughters were in good hands. They were being brought up. I would have done the same thing. No one under 30 could have coped with this situation. Imagine a widower with 2 daughters. He really loved me. I represented the good, fun, happiness. But in reality, there was little happiness or love in Aubazine for Chanel, a place where she'd recall a time when she was in church and noticed a man with a hunchback. And about this, she says, I'd like to have sit down beside him and touch his hump and tell him it didn't matter. And I think this perhaps projects what she would have wished someone had expressed to her, and the hump in this man almost representing a kind of physical manifestation for the nature of her being an abandoned child and something that she felt she was carrying around with her all the time. But ultimately, despite this lack of affection, aubergine came to be a very significant place for Chanel and is something she expressed in her work, as you'll be able to find displays of this inspiration scattered across her artistic career. And I'll give you an example. In the many intricately patterned paved corridors of the Abbey, you can actually find similar designs to be present in the stitching and the beading of Chanel's evening dresses and her diamond jewelry, particularly with this motif that includes the 5-pointed star, which is common in the monastery walls and thus in her own work. You can also find geometric patterns of interlocking knots and loops in the designs of the windows of the Abbey. I love, by the way, how Justine Picardi, who wrote this book, actually went to the monastery and went to these locations and took these great pictures of all of these inspirations, because you can see visually for yourselves, and I'll link this in the description, the designs that look so similar now to what we know as the interlocking C's and the Chanel logo. It's almost hilarious how similar these ideas actually are. And when the nuns went to mass, they wore, and I'll read from the book here, jade crosses and veils over their faces, their throats edged in a white material in contrast to their black dresses. And this theme of colours, or perhaps lack thereof, would reappear very significantly in some of Chanel's most impactful work, particularly with the black dresses and the white to contrast it. But there is a story, or more accurately, a series of versions of this story that has Chanel preparing to wear a dress for her first communion, that we can learn a lot about Chanel from. In one telling of the story, her father sent her a white dress from America. She told Claude Delay, and Claude Delay we're going to mention a few times here, so it's worth noting who it was. She was actually a friend and actually psychoanalyst whom Chanel would speak to a lot in the later years of her life. And so I'm mentioning it because she's an important character here. In the book, you can take a quote directly from Chanel's conversations with Claude Delay, where she says, "It was all ruffles and lace, with the layers of billowing organdie petticoats, and a long veil, 2 rosaries, a string of pearls, and a pair of silk stockings to wear underneath. She had loved this dress as a child, but in her later life she said she hated it for the fact that it was her father's girlfriend who had picked it out, someone Chanel described as a tart with dubious taste." I love how critical Chanel is, by the way. You're going to get that a lot from learning about her, and I think contributes a lot to why she's able to be so decisive from a creative standpoint. In another telling of the story to someone else she speaks to a lot, which is Paul Morand, Chanel explains that her father gifted her a white dress as well as a crown of roses. But then notes, "So as to punish me for being proud, my aunt said to me, 'You're not going to wear that crown of roses, you'll wear a hat.' What agony it was, on top of so many other things, such as the shame to be deprived of the crown." And even if this account is not accurate, it definitely gives this almost like archetypal story of a girl who's denied a crown only to spend her entire life attempting to become worthy of one. But in the final retelling of the story, there was no dress from America, nor is there any mention of her father. Instead, she tells a version of a story where, as the book notes, her aunts wanted her to wear a cap like a peasant's girl, but Gabrielle insisted on something different. And in the end, she got her way and wore a white paper crown of thorns with artificial roses. And I think this seems to be the first of many fights, if true, with the nuns that Chanel has in regards to fashion. Chanel claims that unlike the orphan girls who got to wear black uniforms, she had a newly tailored little black alpaca suit that her aunts gave her once a year. She says, "I should have liked a pink dress or a sky blue one." And by the way, from reading that, you kind of wonder if her dressing people in all black, a move that she becomes famous for later in her career, comes from a kind of desire to tame people's desires for color in the way that she had been told to mute hers by the nuns in the monastery. In the summer, she was given by the nuns a horrible leghorn hat, which had a little piece of velvet and a rose above the brim. It's fascinating how there's this repeating agony around roses. And by the winter, she was made to wear a cloche hat that she describes as very hard with a kind of feather on it. I was told it was a eagle's feather, but I knew it was a turkey's, stiffened with paste. There was a little rubber band in the back that went under one's hair to hold the hat in place when it was windy. I thought the whole business was very ugly. But at the age of 15, Gabrielle was actually allowed to order a dress of her own without any intervention from the nuns or her aunts. And so Chanel chose a clinging mauve material. The dressmakers had to put a bit of taffeta at the bottom with flounce, Parma violet underneath. The book notes that she'd come up with an idea for the flounce dress from a novel, and perhaps this is the closest to the truth Gabrielle could admit in her account of a loveless teenage girl who also lost herself in fiction. I thought that Parma violet was ravishing. My heroine wore it on her hat. The dressmaker didn't have any more, so she put a twig of wisteria on mine. And yes, side note, Chanel did discover a series of romance novels that somehow been smuggled into the convent, and these became an obsession for her in her early years, by the idea of a life that could have a story to it, a narrative, which is something that she would constantly give herself throughout her later years. But then on the first Sunday morning, Gabrielle wore the dress to go into mass, and her aunts told her to take it off. And they sent it back to a dressmaker along with the hat. And you can see how this denial of freedom, if you will, of expression would fuel a girl like Gabrielle to become independent and craft her own clothing, to build a fashion house where no one could tell her what she could or couldn't wear. And whilst we're still talking about the monastery and what it came to mean for Chanel, I want to skip way forward in Chanel's life, a time where she's already successful at this point, making huge amounts of money and looking for a way to spend it. And so she designs herself a large home by the coast, a beautiful, beautiful home away from Paris called La Pausa. And this had a design that took huge inspirations from her time at the monastery. Mademoiselle knew what she wanted. This is a quote from Edgar Majoli, who was the chief building contractor on the project. And the book notes, despite her exactitude, Majoli also remembered Chanel's forbearance and her laughter when she sank to her knees in mud while inspecting the villa's massive foundations. She was always very cheerful when she visited, he said, and perhaps as a consequence, the villa rose from the ground with remarkable speed, taking less than a year to complete. When it was finished, La Pausa consisted of 3 wings, each facing inward toward a spacious courtyard with cloisters reminiscent of Aubergine. Its grace and beauty launched Streiss, the architect Robert Streiss' distinguished career, and later in life he remembered La Pausa as his good luck building. The construction had cost an immense 6 million francs, and Chanel's expenditure on the interiors was equally lavish. Yet, in the end, La Pausa gave the impression of serenity and simplicity. I'll actually continue from the book because it says here, Chanel's first request to the architect was personal. She told Streiss that she wanted him to recreate a large stone staircase in the villa's entrance hall from the original that she remembered from her childhood at Aubergine. So, as to be sure that the details were exact, she dispatched him to visit the abbey, an extraordinary request given Chanel's obliteration of the orphanage from her previous accounts of her past. And when you see the photographs of the staircase side by side that the book provides, you see a beautiful symmetry where inspiration is almost obvious. But the final product has this kind of new, fresh breath of air in it. A fun part of her story, by the way, working with Streiss, was when his car breaks down and he has to take a bus to La Pausa. To this, Chanel learns of this and gives him one of her cars and actually insists on him keeping it. And of course, she clearly just wanted a good job to be done, but that's actually made most clear when she makes a request to Streiss at the start of the project that says, I want everything to be built with the best materials and under the best working conditions. Vogue, who covers Chanel a lot, in their March 1930 edition, noted about the house that there is no doubt that Mademoiselle Gabrielle Chanel is a person with very rare taste. And it is therefore not in the least surprising that she has built herself one of the most enchanting villas that has ever materialized on the shores of the Mediterranean. In the garden, Chanel really displays her specificity and desire for perfection when she's not content with the existing olive grove at La Pausa, And the book notes, she also instructed Majoli to transplant 20 ancient olive trees from Antibes, one of which grew in the center of the courtyard, another echo perhaps of Aubezine. And there is also an account that notes here that the villa's monastic qualities was apparent in its cloisters, as well as the cleanliness of its interiors. And I think this idea of cleanliness is also something that she learns from the nuns, and is actually something she almost dictatorially places upon herself as a value throughout her later life. And again, quoting from Vogue's report, the motif of the interior seems to be an entire absence of knickknacks and unnecessary items. Everything one needs is there, and the most perfect of its kind, but there is nothing superfluous. And I love that Chanel's desire for simplicity is not kind of simplicity for simplicity's sake, but is rather a kind of practicality that's found through essentialism. It's almost like Chanel, by building this house, was building another monastery. It's almost like a sanctuary that she could go to whenever she felt her work was overwhelming and she needed to be at ease, or perhaps it was a place to actually be inspired by, considering Aubezine had provided so much inspiration for her work already. And considering that the monastery at Aubezine was directly causing her to remember the trauma associated with it, this house allowed her to have the relaxation of returning to her childhood from the lavish and ultimately independent nature of her adulthood. She would often say of her childhood, "You speak of it when you're very tired, because it's a time when you had hopes, expectations. I remember my childhood by heart." But the house was clearly an inspiration, as the Duke of Westminster, who was her lover at the time, and Winston Churchill often visited. And even the great painter Salvador Dali stayed there with his family, having felt inspired to paint there, which tells you the place really must have been great if Dali was inspired by it. And so an insight for us here to kind of take away is to not view any circumstance or environment as devoid of inspiration. Even a place full of trauma like the monastery where Chanel would talk of being abused by the nuns, had so many things that Chanel paid enough attention to in order to build a bank of what she later used frequently as prompts for ideas. I'd even advise, from having learnt about Chanel's impact, really, to slow down before rushing off to a place more commonly known for its inspiration. Sure, Chanel eventually travels to Paris, but all of her ideas come from the monastery, which is a place where few who resided in Paris would have ever come from. Because if Chanel's story is one of being unique in execution of your art, you have to have unique inspirations. Chanel would say, "Fashion is a state of mind, by which I mean my own." And so we've already noted here a few instances of where Chanel would be drawn to the power of narratives and would alter parts of her own story. Well, one thing the biography, which I'm glad isn't shy about, is casting doubt on whether Chanel's words had truth to them. And Picardy notes that Chanel would constantly conceive of stories that would mask parts of her life, like how she maintains that she was raised by her aunts, that I've already mentioned, referring to the nuns that she lived among the abbey. About this, Chanel would actually say, "My life didn't please me, so I created my life." But she did this all the time, whether it's from changing the year of her birth on her passport, noting to an American journalist that "My age varies according to the days and the people I happen to be with. And when I'm bored, I feel very old. And since I'm extremely bored with you, I'm going to feel like 1,000 years old in 5 minutes." What a great insult. Or, she uses narrative to remake herself, as Picardy actually writes in the book, into a helpless girl with no control over her destiny, while acknowledging the damage done by her lies, even as she told lies about her lying. And this actually refers to a time when Etienne Balsan, who I've already mentioned in the introduction, was the first lover that Chanel had, who brought Chanel to live at his castle. He actually then begins to worry about the police finding her. Picardy actually quotes Chanel, who says, "I had lied to Monsieur Balsan. I had to keep my age a secret, telling him that I was nearly 20. In actual fact, I was 16. But then Picardy notes, in actual fact, she was over 21 when she arrived at the castle and continued to live there well into her 20s. About this, Picardy says, "Perhaps this was the consoling story that Coco told herself when it appeared that no one had cared, not the police, nor her family, nor anyone else for that matter, that she was intriguing even when it seemed that she was never the center of attention. And even this name, Coco, has tellings of its origin that are often disputed, and Chanel's lying really doesn't help matters. The book writes here, she invented a story that is revealing in its untruths. My father used to call me Little Coco until something better could come along. He didn't like the name Gabrielle at all. It hadn't been his choice. And he was right. Soon the little drifted away and it was simply Coco. It may have been that her father was actually complaining that he didn't like Gabrielle herself and that he had not chosen to have children. But later in the book, we learn of Chanel's desire to sing and dance, a dream that is actually put down enough early on for her to give up entirely on it. And it's at the beginnings of this desire that we learn, as the book notes, that Gabrielle eventually finds a regular evening slot, and she has only 2 songs, Coco Rico, which is a kind of French version of Cock-a-doodle-doo, and Kikavu Coco, which is a little song about a girl who has lost her dog called Coco. And I think you're probably starting to see a theme here. Well, so did the audience. And soon they greeted her with barnyard cockerel calls and christened her with the name of the lost dog. Thus, Gabrielle became Coco, a metamorphosis that might have been humiliating rather than liberating, but nevertheless led to the birth of a legend. And like we discovered with the artist Curtis 50 Cent Jackson in his episode of Icons, Chanel understood the power of perception. But unlike 50 Cent, who was determined always to find a means to connect it to authenticity, Chanel just simply lied and told conflicting stories about her life. After all, whilst living at the Rollier, perhaps embarrassed by her past, Etienne Balzan hid Chanel away in a part of a castle where no one can discover her, particularly when he had evening guests over for the weekend. But refusing to remain stuck, Chanel designs fitting outfits from Balzan's wardrobe, which I mentioned at the beginning. And she did this as to not be ousted for being poor, as she snuck into the parties uninvited. Later in her life, she had actually become famous for her costume jewelry in the 20s by championing a combination of fake gems with real ones. She made it one of her signature looks, mixing precious stones and glass copies with a supreme confidence not dissimilar to the manner in which she blurred truth and lies. This is beautifully well written here by Justine Picardi, creating this incredible parallel there. Back to the book. Admittedly, at times, Gabrielle declared Coco to be an awful name, yet she was proud of its recognition throughout the world, evidence of her indisputable presence, despite the lack of acknowledgement or recognition by her father. And this conflict extends even to how she wants to be addressed. She says, in my own premises, I'm called Mademoiselle. That goes without saying. I certainly don't want to be called Coco in the house of Chanel. But despite all that she was doing to mask her differing background, this background was one of the properties that I believe made up what I'm so drawn to when learning about Chanel, which is her unique artistic edge. I mean, the most obvious edge of all is that the majority of her competition were men, designing clothes for women. You've got famous people like Charles Frederick Worth, Paul Poirier, Jacques Doucet, just to name a few. And you would think that it would be obvious that a designer of the same gender would be better at designing clothes, but due to it being almost impossible for a woman at the time to own her own business or to open a bank account, the invention of House of Chanel was revolutionary. Another one of her edges would come from the fact that whether it was through her British work or even her high society French work, her art, as we kind of touched upon with the influence of her monastery upbringing, always reflects the perspective of the outsider. During her decade-long affair with the Duke of Westminster, the book notes Chanel was incorporating something of Scotland into her new designs. At Lockmore, she borrowed Bendor's clothes, making tweeds of her own and wearing them with a panache not usually associated with traditional sports grab. Having adopted the Duke's wardrobe, she then started sourcing fabrics from a Scottish tweed mill and turning them into her characteristically soft little jackets and suits. And as a side note, although only rumours with no apparent proof, Chanel does account a time when she was proposed to by the Duke of Westminster, to which she refused. And the reason I mentioned it is there's this great quote where she says, there have been many Duchesses of Westminster, but only one Coco Chanel. But anyway, back to the book. Something of the same process occurred during her stays in Eton, where she was inspired by striped waistcoats of Bendor's liveried footmen and butlers, transforming them into what became known to readers of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar as Chanel's English look, which also included the loose woolen cardigans that she wore herself with her yards of pearls. And of course, all of this work ends up being part of Chanel's London house, work inspired by the products of her affair with the Duke of Westminster. And this is marked by the fact that if you walk along certain streets of Mayfair today, you can still see a number of double C's embossed upon old lampposts, a final emblem of the Duke's gesture towards Coco Chanel, a silent mark of their union and of melding a British tradition with French couture in a style all of its own. Her outsider perspective allowed her the freedom to mix styles where others would have been held back by a more limiting nature of tradition. And I sometimes think about this with food. Some of what we know as the best cuisines in the world are actually the least allowing of compromise. Let's think of, French cuisine, Japanese cuisine, Italian cuisine, all the same. But the artists are the ones not held back by their fear, willing to risk tradition and naturally risk also making a ton of mistakes, all in search of some new blend that could bring the best of both inspirations together. And so an insight for us here is to find our own edge by asking ourselves, what two attributes are we going to bring together that no one else has dared to do so? Having now mentioned two love affairs that Chanel had, I think it's worth taking a moment to mention perhaps the most significant love of Chanel's life, Arthur Boy Capel. As Chanel herself notes, the young man was handsome, very tanned and attractive. More than handsome, he was magnificent. I admired his nonchalance. He rode bold and very powerful horses. I fell in love with him. But admittedly, I mentioned Capel not for their love, but rather for what the union became to cement for Chanel, because despite Chanel's love of Boy Capel, he continued to enjoy diversions of other women, as the book notes, where it says, Chanel was aware that he had a capacity to run away from her whenever he chose to, just as her father had run from her mother and from her too. Perhaps there were times where Coco felt angry enough to want to chop her lover's legs off. Instead, she turned her scissors on his clothes. These she stole, cut up so that he could no longer wear them out again. Yet in doing so, she transformed them into something new and uniquely her own, eventually building an empire upon the desire of other women to possess her creations, women who sought her, Coco Chanel, rather than Boy Capel. When Chanel first moved to Paris, she was put up in the Ritz by Etienne Balzan. She says, I had no money. I lived at the Ritz and everything was paid for me. It was an incredible situation. The coquettes were paid. I knew that. I'd been taught that. I said to myself, are you going to become like them? A kept woman? But this is appalling. I didn't want it. And as it says in the book here, but what she did want was to earn her own living. Eventually, after protracted negotiations, Balzan and Capel agreed to share the cost of her setting up in business to sell hats that she was already making for herself and for her friends and their girlfriends. Among her first clients were the coquettes turned actresses who began to wear Chanel's designs on the stage and in magazines. Capel covered the running costs. Balzan provided the premises in Paris at his bachelor apartment. And this is the part that I love. Chanel says, they'd given me a place where I could make my hats the way they would given me a toy, thinking, let's give her something to amuse herself with, and later we'll see. They didn't understand how important this was to me. I just love this. I love that people will underestimate how important something is to you. People will often view the things that you consider to be important as less so. And, I think ultimately this, of course, echoes what I first quoted from Robert Greene's book in the intro, that Chanel, more than anything, wanted something of her own and something that would help her build independence. The biography notes that Chanel goes through a period when she's finding herself fainting a lot, but when she worked, she said her health recovered. And although she never admitted it, the House of Chanel seemed to give her more stability, a sense of where she stood in the world, than what she gained from Boy Capel. The book here continues, hence the story she often told of her distress at discovering that Capel had deposited bank securities as a guarantee for her business and overdrafts, and that the money she believed she was making had not yet repaid her debt. On the evening that she's told this, they had been on their way to dinner. She immediately insisted that they return to their apartment they now shared in Paris. I felt sick, impossible to eat. I glanced up at the pretty things I'd bought with what I thought were my profits. So all of that had been paid for by him. I was living off him. I began to hate this well-brought-up man who was paying for me. The following morning, she went back to Rue Cambon at dawn. This is where her shop is. Angélie, I said to my head seamstress, I am not here to have fun or to spend money like water. I am here to make a fortune. And a year later, Chanel was earning sufficient money to have no more need of Capel's financial support, and she rejoiced in her independence. There is a powerful determination that Chanel has that I love. It's undeniable that Chanel had a big vision, but you can see here that her drive was really the thing that made it happen, and she was determined to make it happen. Chanel would say of her venture that through fashion, I was my own master and I depended on myself alone. Even so, as the book notes here, the House of Chanel still linked Boy Capel and Chanel together, for in some unspoken way, they had set it up as partners. There was no business contract to bind them together, just as there were no marriage certificate, but it nevertheless joined them, as the double C logo seems to suggest Chanel and Capel, overlapping, but also facing away from each other. Again, beautiful writing here by Picardi, pointing out something that is now seemingly obvious to me and yet was almost always there without me understanding why it was there. But yes, it seems that even if Chanel wanted independence, she understood areas where it's unrealistic and impractical to do everything herself. Chanel understood that she needed to collaborate, and she most definitely learns this in the production of her perfume house, which we'll come back to. And this is where I think of the adage, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. But her expression for the importance of independence extends to a time much later in her career as well. At one point, there was a great ambition for Chanel to work in Hollywood, with Samuel Goldwyn of United Artists drawing up a contract for her for $1 million. The New York Times said at the news of this contract that she will reorganize the Department of Dressmaking of United Artists Studios and anticipate fashions 6 months ahead, solving thereby the eternal problem of keeping gowns up to date. And although she promptly leaves Hollywood, admittedly, following the time of her contract, noting that she hadn't really met the high expectations that were set for her, where, according to the New York Times, she was told that her dresses weren't sensational enough. She had made a lady look like a lady. Hollywood wants a lady to look like two ladies. But she did help in regards to using her practical sense to actually help the aesthetic component flourish. And in reference to making the film Palmy Days, it says in the book here, Chanel had insufficient time to supervise all of the costume design. However, her instinct for fluidity and movement manifested itself in the decision to make 4 versions of a dress for the Ingénue Barbara Weeks. Each looked identical, but was cut with minute yet precise variations to be seen at its most flattering in different scenes, whether the actress was standing, sitting, or dancing. I love this. And it's funny because Chanel, after departing Hollywood, notes of this time, the Americans wanted to tie me down because I out-fashion fashion, but I am not for sale or hire. In Hollywood, the stars are just the producer's servants. And by doing so, you can see she's emphasized her independence again, this time from the power of the Hollywood studios in saying, I am not for sale or hire. But I think with that line, she also recognizes and finally sees her own value, that her work at the House of Chanel was worth much more than the $1 million that she got from the contract with Hollywood. The book notes, Chanel declared she would not submit to anyone, nor to the dogma that American culture would lead fashion, as well as everything else in the world, and was at pains to make this clear even at a time when she ceased designing at Rue Cambon. Paris will no longer create fashion, I hear people say. New York will invent it, Hollywood will propagate it, and Paris will be subjected to it. I don't believe that. I, who admire American films, am still waiting for studios to impose a figure, a color, and a style of clothing. Hollywood can deal successfully with the face, with the outline, the hairstyle, the hands, the toenails, with portable bars, refrigerators in the drawing room, clock radios. But it doesn't deal any more successfully with the central problem of the body, which it has not managed to disassociate from man's inner drama, and which remains the prerogative of the great designers and ancient civilizations. Wow. And, Chanel also has some views on America that she expresses that I think will tell us more about her than about America, but I really want to note them here. The book says, on the one hand, it was a continent that made her rich through the vast sales of her perfumes, for which Americans seem to have an insatiable appetite. They'll buy every luxury, she said to Delay, and the first of all luxuries is perfume. And yet, part of her, austere as a nun, resisted the seductions offered to her by America. Describing her hotel suite in Hollywood to Delay, Chanel listed its comforts with a certain amount of contempt: 2 bedrooms, 4 television sets, including one that could be watched in the bathroom. All that is for people who have gone soft. The English hide everything. The Americans show everything. America is dying of comfort. I mentioned a quote there from the book that noted that Americans seem to love Chanel's perfume. Well, this is not just a reflection of America's market. This is a reflection of Chanel's most commercially successful and impactful product, Chanel No. 5. The book notes here, if Chanel No. 5 was in its way revolutionary, both in its chemistry and the logo and label that needed no translation in different languages, then it has also come to represent constancy, an unbroken connection with the woman who made it her own. No. 5 seems in one sense to be entirely abstract, a complete thing itself, rather than a conceptual philosophy, but it's also a catalyst to the imagination, a clue to unravel the mystery of Coco Chanel, as immaterial yet unyielding as the designer herself. But I think, more so than talking about the success of Chanel, it's worth examining how Chanel actually markets it and introduces it into the world. It's a really interesting thing here because, as Robert Greene notes, to launch the perfume, Chanel decided upon a subliminal campaign, and that she did. In Picardi's book, she writes, the evening after she had chosen the sample of No. 5 in Ernest Beau's laboratory, this is the French-Russian perfumer that she worked with, Chanel took a vial of the scent to the most fashionable restaurant. As she dined with her friends, she sprayed the woman past her table with the new perfume. You've got to be able to lead them by their nose, she told Delay, many years later, having done so with her original customers for Chanel No. 5, spraying it in her boutiques across France. Underplaying her commercial ambitions, but nevertheless suggesting to her best clients that they were in on the secret long before anyone else. And Robert Greene actually expands on the details of this in his own book, noting that she would then slip bottles of the perfume without labels into the bags of the wealthiest and best connected clients. Soon, women began to talk of this strange new scent, rather haunting and impossible to identify as any known flower. The word of yet another Chanel creation began to spread like wildfire, and women were soon showing up at her store, begging to buy this new scent, which she now began to place discreetly on shelves. In the first few weeks, she couldn't stock enough. Nothing like this had ever happened in the industry, and it would go on to become the most successful perfume in history. Now, there are 2 things to note here. First is the spraying of other guests in the restaurant and slipping bottles into bags. I mean, this is a kind of guerrilla marketing I've never heard of before, and I just love the idea of. I can imagine it likely creating an association between the smell and the luxurious places that she sprayed people in, right? So that once the smell was located again in the Chanel stores by those same wealthy people, they would latch onto it, as suggested by the comment, you've got to lead them by the nose. But you can also imagine that she's likely just testing it by people watching from her table, which is something she would do a lot of in her life. But she's observing the reactions of those she sprayed as they curiously smelled each other. So an immediate lesson for us here would be to find ways you can trial and then observe the most authentic reactions to your work in the wild. If you're a writer, for example, take inspiration from the author Tim Ferriss, who, before publishing his first book, he would actually place different covers over various business books inside the local bookshop, where he would sit down with a coffee and then just observe how people reacted to each of them. And this eventually helped him inform him on the title and the cover choices that he actually went for. And then secondly, the fact that she would spray the scent in the stores before it was even available, denying its existence unless you were kind of let in on the secret, gives those who were let in early a kind of sense of ownership, and in behavioral science, they refer to this as the endowment effect, where someone ascribes more value onto something when they believe that they have some kind of ownership over it. And artists who use crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter actually achieve a similar effect, where people feel they're more than just consumers, but they're actually fans who helped enable and facilitate this work to come into fruition. And those fans will do much more to market and speak highly about your art than any other consumer would. Basically, the lessons from her means of creating interest for Chanel No. 5 stems in a lot of what Chanel does creatively. She creates mystery. Robert Greene writes, she surrounded herself and what she made with an aura of mystery. She never talked about her impoverished childhood. Nobody really concretely knew anything about her. She carefully controlled the number of her public appearances. She knew the value of disappearing for a while. She never revealed the recipe for her perfume or her creative process in general. Her oddly compelling logo, all of this gave endless space for the public to imagine and speculate about the Coco myth. And this actually links to something I read whilst learning about a previous icon I've covered, Charlie Chaplin. Whilst Chaplin had his brother Sidney reviewing offers following the end of his contract with the studio S&A, Chaplin was actually living in Santa Monica in a house facing the sea. And whilst living in Santa Monica, he would often dine at Nat Goodwin's cafe at the end of the pier. And Nat Goodwin is a man that Charlie Chaplin says, he considered the greatest actor and light comedian on the American stage. Well, they eventually become good friends, and to much of Chaplin's delight, Nat would actually join him on autumn evening walks across the deserted ocean front. Well, it's on these walks that Nat Goodwin makes a wise set of comments to Charlie Chaplin upon hearing that he was moving to New York after the completion of his film that he was working on whilst in Santa Monica. He says, "You made a remarkable success, and there would be a wonderful life ahead of you if you know how to handle yourself. When you get to New York, keep off Broadway. Keep out of the public's eye. The mistake with many successful actors is they want to be seen and admired, but it only destroys the illusion. You'll be invited everywhere, but don't accept. Pick out 1 or 2 friends and be satisfied to imagine the rest. You've captivated the world, and you can continue to do so if you stand outside of it." And I've talked about the power of mystique and allure of an artist being important in the 50 Cent episode, and even referenced The Weeknd, who has been someone who kind of perfectly epitomizes that mystique by being one of the most successful music artists of all time, and yet only having done a handful of interviews throughout his career. And Chanel herself avoided interviews upon her return from a 15-year career hiatus after the war. To me, it seems that once someone is established, the mystique and allure of them being seemingly untouchable brings further intrigue into their work. But to be fair, on the flip side, a lot of artists are finding success being more relatable and approachable via social media and podcasts. And I immediately think here of comedians like Shane Gillis, who have found great success on being approachable and authentic on his podcast. And through this, you kind of feel like you know him, but then again, the lack of podcast appearances from the iconic comedian Dave Chappelle makes him feel larger than life, a feeling that likely draws crowds and makes you want to watch every special that he puts out. But either way, there is an undeniable power to mystery and the intrigue that it brings about. But despite this more protective nature, Chanel's definitely less protective when it comes to how she dealt with copycats. And I think there's a lesson here for us as marketers. Because according to the V&A curator Aureole Cullen, Chanel's clothing was extremely expensive at the time, but she was not averse to people copying. She understood that the dissemination of her style actually worked to her advantage, and Robert Greene writes about this in The Laws of Human Nature, where he notes the context. He says, "Piracy was a great problem in fashion, as knockoffs of established designs would appear all over the world after a show. Designers carefully guarded all of their secrets and fought through courts any form of imitation. Chanel did the opposite. She welcomed all sorts of people into her shows and allowed them to take photographs. She knew this would only encourage the many people who made a living out of creating cheap versions of her clothes, but she wanted this. She even invited wealthy women to bring along their seamstresses, who would make sketches of the designs and then create replicas of them. More than making money, she wanted most of all to spread her fashions everywhere, to feel herself and her work to be objects of desire by women of all classes and nations. And this immediately makes me think of an excellent marketing campaign that happened recently that athleisure wear brand Lululemon named their Dupe Swap campaign. In this campaign, Lululemon acknowledges that their products, being relatively expensive, were being avoided by people who wanted to achieve a similar look but couldn't justify the price that Lululemon were charging. And so instead, people would buy knockoffs known as dupes or, duplicates. And this kind of became popularized by people on social media who were showing off their ability to find similar clothes to what Lululemon was selling. But rather than trying to fight this trend, Lululemon did something incredibly inventive and I think echoes Chanel's strategy. They held a physical 2-day event in Los Angeles called a Dupe Swap, where people could bring a pair of off-brand Lululemon look-alike leggings and swap them for a brand new pair of the brand's own leggings. And in a similar move, Adobe actually famously allows people to rip off their products like Photoshop and After Effects, particularly students who couldn't afford the products, knowing that those same students, having learned how to design using those tools, would then likely see those tools as being the kind of de facto tool when it comes to continuing to use them in their first jobs. So let's examine what both of these companies do. They effectively see that the more recognition something gets, and thus the more overt copies there are of that product, the more a desire and a status of the original brand is elevated. And so as an artist, for as long as you're known to be the original, don't fear others copying. Now, whilst we've just mentioned Chanel number 5, I'm reminded I want to cover some pretty significant decisions that Chanel made, particularly around the Second World War, that would kind of haunt her for the rest of her life. At first, at the top of the war, as the Nazis marched into Paris, Chanel closed the shop, but she was able to seemingly do so very quickly on the basis that she was basically involved with a German officer. And also, there's speculation that she closed the shop in kind of a retaliation of a strike that the employees went on a few years earlier, despite being some of the best paid seamstresses at the time. And then secondly, there's also often speculation that Chanel may have been a German spy during the war, referring to her having had a spy number within the German government. And whilst critics would say, this was a piece of revelatory information linking Chanel to German intelligence operations, an anti-Nazi activist, Sergei Karlsfeld, declared actually that just because Chanel had a spy number doesn't necessarily mean she was personally involved. Some informers had numbers without even being aware of it. But this speculation also comes with the fact that from something I mentioned earlier, Chanel had a really good relationship with Winston Churchill and the Duke of Westminster. But again, does this prove that she's a spy? Well, it's not completely clear, because actually it's more likely that high-ranking generals of Germany who were actually opposed to Hitler's actions wanted to use Chanel to broker peace with Churchill. And there was a moment in this time when Chanel personally delivers a letter to actually have this communicated to Churchill. Lastly, something that seems, I think, much harder to dispute. During the war, Chanel opportunistically tries to use an anti-Jewish law set about by the Nazis to try to get majority ownership of the Chanel perfume company back, which was operating separately from the House of Chanel. And in a deal, becomes actually 90% owned by the Wertheimer family, who still own it today and who were Jewish and are Jewish. But either way, this move isn't successful in the end, because the Wertheimer family, anticipating the forthcoming Nazi mandates against the Jews, had legally turned over control of Parfums Chanel to a French businessman called Félix Amiot. And at the end of the war, Amiot returned Parfums Chanel to the hands of the Wertheimers. Whatever this says about Chanel, I felt it important to highlight, as these key conversation topics would forever remain to tarnish her reputation. But lastly, I want to speak about Chanel's creative approach. And in the biography, Picardi does a wonderful job of highlighting the parallels between her artistic process and the symbol of scissors. almost like a ceremonial necklace. The moment Chanel steps into her place of work at Rue Cambon, her assistant would actually hang a long white tape around Chanel's neck with her special scissors threaded through it, it says in the book. By this point, Chanel was never sewing. She had left that far behind her back in her modest past as a seamstress, and before then, as a child of the orphanage. But she's still wielding her scissors on a daily basis to shape and remake her creations. What you have to do is cut, she said to Delay. There is this great quote in a Time article that reads, "Chanel is no innovator for novelty's sake. She devotes her energies to barely noticeable refinements of detail of her suits and dresses. With scissors hanging from a ribbon around her neck and her 4 fingers firmly together in a characteristically Coco gesture, she pats a new suit in various places. She may say, 'Make a pleat here,' an intelligent pleat. One of this year's suits was changed 35 times after being made up before Coco was satisfied." And I love the degree of refining that Chanel does here. But as Picardi points out, Chanel's job was as much a reducer as she was a producer. And the product of the refinement of details in fashion, but really of all art, is what I think people end up being most attached to. You know, it speaks to this deep part of us and I think satisfies us quite a lot. But rather than speaking to this quality myself, I thought instead to quote a speech made in one of the scenes of the first season of the HBO show Westworld, where the park creator, Dr. Ford, played masterfully by Anthony Hopkins, explains to a park creative how one can actually make an enduring masterpiece in response to a presentation being made by that park creative. He says, "No, I don't think so. What's the point of it? It's got a couple of cheap thrills, some surprises, but that's not enough. It's not about giving the guests what you think they want. That's simple. Titillation, horror, elation. They're parlor tricks. The guests don't return for the obvious things we do, the garish things. They come back because of the subtleties, the details. They come back because they discover something they imagined no one else has ever noticed before, something they fall in love with." The scissors continue to be a great theme as the book notes her desire to cut away from places, people, and things, to be independent and then to do something with that independence. Because she says herself, in old age, when she's showing Claude Delay her boxes from the Duke of Westminster, she points out this coat of arms engraved on the top, and she says if she were to mark her own emblem next to his, she said, "I would add my scissors." And throughout this episode, you've probably realized, as I've done, that Chanel has some incredibly quotable lines. And I wanted to just note a few here because I couldn't not mention them. She says, "In order to be irreplaceable, one must be different. A woman who overdoes it with perfume has no future, for she will only offend her friends and admirers. Spray yourself wherever you might be kissed." Some people think luxury is the opposite of poverty. It is not. It is the opposite of vulgarity. And lastly, she says, "Simplicity is the keynote of all true elegance." You know, there is that simplicity, but I think her quotes are not just simple. They're actually quotable because they're refined. And Claude Delay would say, "I remember Coco cutting bits of a typed page of maxims she had written and making them into thin strips for me. I remember watching the remains getting smaller and smaller." And she would say, "That's how you arrive at a text." Now, despite her direction and powerful drive, perhaps a degree of introspection was kind of lacking throughout the journey, and it leaves Chanel with some painful regrets towards the end of her life. As the book notes, there were times where Delay sat with Chanel in the apartment at Rue Cambon long after everyone else had gone home, sensing the courtier's spirits sinking as darkness fell, scissors set aside. It was at these moments that Chanel would say that her life was a failure, that she had lost those whom she adored, and that there was nothing worse than being alone. But all that was left to her were dresses and coats. "A woman who is not loved is no woman," she said to Delay. "Whatever her age, a woman needs to be looked at by a man who loves her. Without that look, she dies." Chanel would actually tell something similar to her niece. She would say, a simple life with a husband and children, a life with the people you love, that is the real life. And I'm sure there's a degree of the grass is always greener on the other side here, but it is quite insane for her to talk about a life that she basically didn't have, that she drove to not have, and talk about it as the life that is real. Then at the age of 86, disaster struck when her right hand was paralyzed in what appeared to be sudden nerve damage. She was rushed instead to hospital. Delay found her there in bed, her hand hanging down inert. A priest had arrived earlier, Chanel said. She had woken up to discover him looming at her bedside. Too soon, she snapped, and sent him away. The January collection was awaiting completion at Rue Cambon, and even with her right hand limp, unable to hold her scissors, nothing was going to stop Mademoiselle Chanel from returning to her studio. I love this attitude. She's almost looking at her final moments and still seeing that instead, the work that she needs to complete is more important. And this attitude is one that she never lets go of, as the book notes. On the day before her death, Mademoiselle was still working, even though it was a Saturday, furiously racing against the clock to finish her latest couture collection. The following morning, Claude Delay came to visit her at the Ritz at 1 o'clock, where she found her sitting at her dressing table again, applying makeup, carefully drawing on her dark eyebrows and red lipstick, examining her reflection in the mirror. I love that she never lets that go. They lunched together downstairs at Chanel's usual table, out of the way where the courtier could watch others in the restaurant without being watched herself. And then, long after the room had emptied, the two women finally left for an afternoon drive. The car drove them up Champs-Élysées and through the streets of Paris, while a wintry sunshine finally emerged through the mist. Chanel told Delay that she hated the setting sun and that she should have worn her dark glasses. By the time the car had brought them back to the Ritz, the sun had disappeared. A full moon was rising. Delay said goodbye, and as Chanel disappeared through the door of the Ritz, she called out that she'd be working again at Rue Cambon, as usual, the next day. The next morning, Chanel's body lay in her white bedroom at the Ritz. Her maid had dressed her in a white suit and blouse and tucked her hands beneath the linen sheets. She looked very small, said Delay, almost like a little girl taking her first communion. Following her last show in January 1971, put on 2 weeks after her death, a British newspaper touted her collection as the answer to a modern woman's dilemma. In preparation for this podcast, I not only read the books I mentioned earlier and watched a documentary, but also attended the V&A exhibition that showcased Chanel's many years of work. So if you are curious as to what I think is the best piece of art that Gabrielle Coco Chanel has ever made, I made a free downloadable PDF available in the link in the podcast show notes, where I talk about the piece and dissect it. Also, for more on icons, follow the Icons Pod on Twitter or the Icons Podcast on LinkedIn to learn from the artists not covered on the podcast. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.